Reflecting on Art by John Andrew Fisher, Fisher. This book is from Mayfield Publishing Company, Mountain View, California, London, and Toronto. John Andrew Fisher of University of Colorado Boulder. Introduction, Definition and Subjectivity, the Ineffability of Art. To some people, philosophy of art may sound like an unstable chemical compound, ready to blow apart at any moment. In the popular mind, the arts are associated with subjectivity, sensory experience, and even insanity, whereas philosophy is associated with dry and abstract theorizing. Those familiar with philosophy can add that philosophers attempt to produce objective and rational accounts of phenomena, the very opposite of what many people take to be possible with art. In spite of this seeming incompatibility, philosophers have theorized about the arts since the beginning of philosophy, and some of the most important figures in the history of philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, have made significant contributions to the philosophy of art. Of course, the philosophy of a field need not have the characteristics of that field. The philosophy of law does not itself have the character of a legal system. The philosophy of mathematics does not have the rigor and formal structure of mathematics. Still, articulating a philosophy of art seems to present special problems. Two in particular are given preliminary examination in this chapter. The first is the familiar difficulty of providing an adequate definition of art. The second, one writer refers to the apparent impenetrability of a concept of art, which embraces both the Mona Lisa and piles of bricks. The second is the equally familiar notion that works of art depend on the subjective evaluations of audiences. This notion tempts us to reason in the following way. Art essentially depends on the spectator's response. The spectator's response is entirely subjective, hence, art is entirely subjective. This general skepticism about art finds its most familiar expression in the habitual doubts that many people have about the validity of art criticism. Let's look more closely at these two problems. Can art be defined? Before discussing this issue, we must clarify our terminology. In contemporary English, the term art is used in two different ways. In its narrow meaning, art denotes just the visual arts, that is, painting, sculpture, drawings, and so on. But in the philosophy of art, the terms art, artist, and work of art are not associated solely with the visual arts. There is a more important, broader use of the term art, which is reflected in our ability to refer collectively to literature, music, dance, visual arts, and so on as the arts. By conceptually yoking together creative activities in these various media, we imply that they are similar in virtue of being art-making activities. We imply this whenever we refer to composers, poets, or dancers or as artists, or whenever we say, for instance, that the composer Ludwig van Beethoven was one of the greatest artists who ever lived, or that the writer James Joyce is an important artist of the 20th century. The expression work of art is especially open in its application to a broad spectrum of creative products, among them operas, ballets, poems, and the like. This broad sense of art and artist is the sense in which thinkers traditionally have discussed the nature and importance of art. Philosophy of art examines art in this broad sense. The broad use of art and artist closely corresponds to the familiar broad use of the terms science and scientist, just as biologists, physicists, and geologists are all scientists, and biology, physics, and geology are all sciences. So too are poets, painters, and composers, artists, and poetry, painting, and music arts. To say this is not to say several things. First, it is not to say that such classifications are easy or uncontroversial, even in the sciences. Second, it is not to imply that these classifications are closed and unalterable, even in the sciences. Are parapsychology and creation science, for example, real sciences? Third, it is not to beg the question of whether there is an essence or nature that defines art or science. I will return to this question in a moment. Finally, it is to imply that the concept of art from now on, it is not to imply that the concept of art, from now on I will use the term only in the broad sense, is as clear or uncontroversial as the concept of science. There are serious and long-standing arguments about whether certain activities and media, for example, jazz, furniture making, and movies, deserve to be considered art. These controversies reflect the high status we attach to art. In the words of one philosopher of art, nothing equals the value and importance of the arts. Such claims raise the philosophical question of whether we can specify a concept of art that not only is clear and consistent, but also can explain this importance. The question of whether art can be defined has many facets. There are those who say that art cannot be defined because its very nature is to be original and always changing. Moreover, for every characteristic that traditionally might have been proposed to define art in general, or to define subcategories of art such as play, painting, piece of music, or dance, there are experimental 20th century artworks that lack that characteristic. For many arts, it seems the content of art has become its own undefinability. Chapter 5 examines the challenge posed by avant-garde art. Then there are those who claim that each individual must determine what is and is not art. In a different vein, some claim that there is nothing common to all works of art. The order suggested by our use of the term art to cover all the various arts is an artificial order that does not correspond to any real property or set of properties in the world. Is there something that all works of art, whether plays, paintings, or string quartets, have in common? Something that makes them works of art and distinguishes them from other activities and artifacts? Some social critics of art charge that the very concept of art draws invidious distinctions between the culture of the elite and the cultures of the lower classes by implying that what the educated and powerful enjoy, being art, is somehow of a different and more valuable order. It's easy to see why the problem of how to define art is one of the most important concerns of modern art theory. The many theoretical accounts of art proposed over the centuries have all presupposed that there is a definition of art. Yet, as we have seen, many thinkers, both art theorists and artists, have held that no valid definition can be given. Suppose we cannot define art, will we be defeated before we begin? Does the philosophy of art depend on our being able to give a definition of art? I will argue that the answer is no. Thinkers have traditionally assumed that words and they express abstract concepts. For example, such words as justice, truth, and art are used to refer to some central property that instances of the concept must exemplify. Thus, an action is just because it exemplifies justice. In a parallel fashion, a piece of music, for instance, is a work of art if it exemplifies the essential property or properties that characterize a work of art. This traditional assumption has been seriously questioned by 20th century philosophers. Philosophers under the influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951, have attacked the idea that all objects designated by a common name must exhibit certain common properties. In aesthetics, the philosopher Morris Weitz applies Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances to explain how we can pick out works of art from other things even though there is no strict logical definition of art. In White's view, the search for a definition of art is a search for a set of properties that are separately necessary and jointly sufficient for an item to be art. When, for example, we define a square as a plane figure having 4 equal sides and 4 right angles, we are saying that having exactly 4 sides is a necessary condition for something to be a square. If a figure has only 3 sides or more than 4 sides, it cannot be a square. Likewise, it is a necessary condition to be a square that a figure have 4 right angles. Moreover, we are saying that the figures having all of these properties is sufficient to allow us to apply the term square to the figure. If a plane figure is 4-sided and has 4 right angles, it is necessarily a square. If there are necessary and sufficient conditions that define art, then there are properties that every work of art must have, and the possession of which guarantees that something is a work of art. White's claims that the concept of art cannot be defined in this way, nor can any of art's sub-concepts such as tragedy, painting, opera, and so on. He draws our attention to Wittgenstein's famous discussion of the concept of a game. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common, or they would not be called games. But look and see whether there is anything common to all, for if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing. White applies this idea to the concept of art. If we actually look and see what it is that we call art, we will also find no common properties, only strands of similarities. Knowing what art is not apprehending some manifest or latent essence, but being able to recognize, describe, and explain those things we call art in virtue of these similarities. Many philosophers have attacked White's claim that we can find no common property that defines art. These philosophers have suggested various sophisticated definitions that attempt to capture what all works of art have in common. See Chapter 5. But what if White's is correct? What are the consequences for philosophy of art? It seems obvious that White's own view is a sort of philosophy of art. It tells us the nature of art. In White's terminology, art is an open concept not bounded by strict and unchanging conditions of application. The possibility of philosophy of art, then, does not depend on our formulating a set of properties that define art. We can make generalizations about art even if we cannot specify any one thing that all works of art or art activities have in common. To clarify the issue, we can distinguish what I will call the naive problem of defining art from what I will call the philosophical problem of defining art. The philosophical problem is just the question of whether we can find a formula that defines necessary and or sufficient conditions for art. White claims that no such definition can be found. Others disagree, but clearly this is a dispute within a philosophy of art. The naive problem, by contrast, is fundamental to having a rational discussion about the nature of art. It is the problem of whether we can agree on examples of art. If we cannot agree even on the examples, we do not have a common conception of what phenomena we are trying to understand. The naive problem is resolvable. We can agree on examples of art, although not as clearly as we can agree, for instance, on examples of science. We simply have to appeal to the traditions and institutions of art, keeping an open mind about what to include or exclude. It is true that we are caught in a conceptual circle connecting three concepts: art, artists, and the arts. Art is what artists make. Artists are those who participate in the arts. The arts are those cultural activities that exemplify art. Practically speaking, however, there is no great difficulty in specifying our object of study by referring to the European tradition of the arts. This is implicitly what the National Endowment for the Arts does when it provides grants to poets but not to gardeners, to symphony orchestras but not to sports teams. The heart of this approach is to remind ourselves of paradigm cases, cases that exemplify what the expression art means, as well as what the subconcepts poem, sonata, tragedy mean. Such paradigms inevitably include the great masterpieces of the arts. Surely we can agree that the greatest poets, painters, novelists, composers, and playwrights of the past and present are artists, and that their finest works are works of art. We agree that Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Michelangelo are paradigm cases of great artists who produce great works of art. So we can at least start with Dime. Start with agreement about plenty of examples. Keeping these examples in mind, perhaps we can eventually produce some account of this phenomenon, either in the form of a theory or definition of art. In fact, the philosophical problem of how to define art arises because we have an enormous variety of examples that we agree are art, but that we cannot easily define. The crucial question is whether predicate blank is art is arbitrary or not. Are there truth conditions for X is art? That is, conditions that make the statement X is art true or false. White argues that although there are no necessary or sufficient conditions for X, like blank, is art, there are criteria of recognition that make it correct to describe something as a work of art. Thus, mostly when we describe something as a work of art, we do so under the conditions of there being present some sort of artifact made by human skill, ingenuity, and imagination, which embodies in its sensuous public medium stone, wood, sounds, words, etc., certain distinguishable elements and relations. White's claims that even these features are not strictly necessary, although most works of art exemplify these properties as well as many other typical features. I would add to White's list of typical features of art that most works of art have some sort of intended audience. Moreover, it seems generally true that the audience assumes a special attitude toward the artifact. This attitude or mode of attention is difficult to define, but it seems to be such that multiple experiences of the very same artifact or performance do not diminish that artifact's value or interest to the audience. This gives artworks a universal quality that differentiates them from the momentary interest evoked by a sports contest, for example. Even though not governed by strict conditions of application, the expression art is governed by criteria of application and recognition. White holds that the question of whether to extend the notion of art to novel sorts of work is not arbitrary, as he says about the extension of the concept of a novel to new experimental writings. What is at stake is no factual analysis concerning necessary and sufficient properties, but a decision as to whether the work under examination is similar in certain respects to other works, already called novels. The same is true, according to White, of the concept of art itself. Thus, even though the concept of art is perhaps vague, it is not arbitrary. Sometimes people react to the controversy surrounding the philosophical problem of defining art by offering a private definition of art. This is art as I think it is. Hence, whatever I think is art is art. There are two objections to this personal definition. First, art is a very public concept, however vague. My thinking that something is a work of art has no more to do with whether the language community that determines the meaning of art will count it as art than my thinking that the Empire State Building is a game has anything to do with whether others will consider it a game. Second, there is a blatant circularity in the very idea of this definition. In the case of art, what is it I am attributing to the object I think it is art? If I think it is art. In the case of art, what is it I am attributing to the object if I think it is art? Either I think it is relatively similar to accepted works of art, in which case we can have a rational debate about that. I could be wrong, or I think it is some sort of thing I think is blank. But how do I fill in the blank where art should go? Remember, art is what I think is art. If I use this alleged definition to fill the blank, I get this. It is the sort of thing I think is the sort of thing I think is blank. Again, I cannot complete my thought. I am caught in a circle. I can never put any content into my claim that this is art, because my only thought is that this is what I call art. But what is that? A more coherent but still problematic idea is that only artists have the right to determine what is and is not art. Often this idea is put forward because of prejudice against critics, theorists, and even the general public. The idea is that only practitioners can define a field, but art isn't a private concept of artists, not even in the way that, of necessity, science is determined by scientists. This proposal, in fact, poses all sorts of difficulties. Who are the artists? How do we define those who have the right to determine what is art? Are art students such artists? Are students who take one or two art classes such artists? Does an art student know more about the arts than, say, an art historian? Do teachers of the arts count if they are not themselves commercially successful artists? Will people who have sung or played musical instrument, which is virtually everyone, count as artists with the right to determine the answer? Are gallery directors, music scholars, poetry editors, dance critics, and faithful members of the audience for the arts not entitled to a valid opinion? When two artists disagree, are they both right? Finally, there is again the problem of putting content into this definition. What is an artist judging on this definition when he or she judges that X is art? That other artists will agree? But what are they agreeing about? The only plausible answer seems to be White's. The judgment is that X is relevantly similar to paradigm works of art. But any knowledgeable person can take part in such a discussion, and any unknowledgeable person, even an artist, could be wrong. In this regard, the difference between art and science is that scientists are often the only people expert enough to determine whether new scientific practice conforms to acceptable science. Scientists can function as autonomous experts determining science, whereas because of the very nature of art, the audience, critics, curators, editors, art historians, and theorists play a substantive role in determining the direction of art. Cultural relativism. Some thinkers are not troubled by our possible failure to reach agreement about what counts as art. Rather, this agreement is precisely what worries them. They hold that the concept of art is merely conventional, that it is governed by a convention that identifies a group of artifacts favored by the elite of society. Let me label this view the cultural relativist position. The sociologist Herbert Gans formulates a relativist position in his book Popular Culture and High Culture. Although Gans does not articulate a view about the concept of art, he does wish to defend popular culture, which includes popular entertainment forms and media not usually counted as art, against those who attack them as inferior to what Gans labels high culture. We may assume that high culture includes the world of the arts, the world of original paintings and museums, serious literature, classical music, and so on. Popular culture would include magazines, television programs, and popular music, among other things. Gans argues for the equality of everyone's choice of cultural products, lowbrow as well as highbrow. He makes his point this way. There are a number of popular cultures, and they, as well as high culture, are all taste cultures, which function to entertain, inform, and beautify life, among other things, and which express values and standards of taste and aesthetics. Taste cultures, as I define them, consist of values, cultural forms which express these values: music, art, design, literature, drama, comedy, poetry, criticism, news, and the media in which these are expressed: books, magazines, newspapers, records, films, and television programs, paintings, and sculpture, architecture, and as far as ordinary consumer goods also express aesthetic values or functions: furnishings, clothes, appliances, automobiles as well. Relativists might intend to make one of two very different critiques of the concept of art. He or she might claim that every class or taste public has its own art, and those art forms are only expressions of the values of the elite classes, whereas in fact each taste public has comparably substantial art which has been overlooked because of prejudice. He or she might claim that the values represented by art, for example, originality, artistic freedom, expression, uniqueness, sophistication, knowledge of the history of an art form, affirmation of humanistic ideals, are themselves only the values of the elite classes, and that the values represented by art forms and media of popular culture, for example, escapism, mass production and marketing, artistic anonymity, and anonymity, audience dominance, are just as valid. To emphasize a radical relativism, I have characterized the second position in a way that makes it appear unattractive. In a sense, it is simply an attack on art and has a proposal to replace it with a different set of cultural values. A full rebuttal of this view, however, would require the development of a theory of art, both to see what is the value of art and also to see whether it is really true that popular culture does not produce art in the traditional sense. There's a quote by Sir Kenneth Clark. There were, and perhaps still are, people who used to maintain that the word masterpiece was merely the expression of a personal opinion deriving from whim and fashion. This belief seems to me to undermine the whole fabric of human greatness. Those who hold the first position argue that we ought to spread, which is about all the taste publics have their own thing, they've been overlooked by prejudice. Argue that we ought to, those who hold the first position argue that we ought to spread our net more broadly when considering what deserves the status of art. We should look at popular cultural forms, not just those forms validated by habit and tradition, One might argue, for example, that rock videos could be the most important art form of the 1980s. This is plausible, but if the relativist goes on to claim that all popular art forms are just as much art as high art forms, then the relativist appears tempted not only by the questionable idea that something is art merely because it is in a certain form, which we will examine this idea in chapter 6, but also by the far more dubious claim that all forms are equal. It is one thing to claim that a popular movie, for instance, It's a Wonderful Life, has more artistic interest than an art film made by a serious artist, or that a jazz performance, for example, John Coltrane's Giant Steps, is just as profound as a performance of classical music, for instance, Horowitz's performance of Chopin Etude. It is another to claim that Sousa marches, just because they are marches, have equal claim to the label art as any symphony, or that comic books, just by virtue of being comic books, are just as much works of art as novels. It is one thing to be open-minded about various media and forms. It is another to insist a priori that all media and forms are of equal worth. But the relativist is tempted to do precisely this. Because our paradigms of art come from high art, it does not follow that we must embrace the notion that there are special art media which only the high arts exemplify, nor that the music, painting, dancing, and decorating of folk or popular art cannot count as art. To ground the meaning of the concept of art and paradigms from the high arts does not require us to limit art to the high arts. Indeed, the need to determine whether the traditional elitism that accompanies the notion of art is justified is a stream ugh, is a strong reason for trying to develop a systematic theory of art. Such a theory may well show that what we value in traditional masterpieces is alive and well in folk or popular arts or in new art media. For example, it is because many people using an intuitive concept of art have recognized the important artistic similarities between photography, jazz, and movies on the one hand, and artwork in the high art tradition on the other, that these newer forms have become increasingly accepted as art. Only with some explicit theory of the nature of art can we rationally debate about what is and isn't art. Criticism and subjectivity of art. To quote Gustave Flaubert, the time has come to give art by a pitiless method the precision of the natural sciences, but the principal difficulty for me is still the style, the indefinable beauty resulting from the conception itself. Criticism and the subjectivity of art. Whereas a scientific theory addresses objects, properties, and events in the external world and is judged according to the accuracy with which it describes them, a work of art can be judged only by how it affects its audience or how well it conforms to the artist's inner life. Or so many people think. It seems undeniable that, in the end, a work of art has to please the sensibilities of its audience. As a result, it may appear that the content and quality of a work of art can be judged only on the basis of how it affects people. If this contention is true, criticism would be nearly impossible, for surely our critical evaluations of art need to be objective. Yet how could they be if they are merely about our variable and idiosyncratic inner lives? As this dilemma illustrates, the problem of criticisms are both deep and interesting. On the one hand, criticism is surely both possible and important. On the other hand, as we have just seen, it is extremely difficult to see why it works. I will not attempt to cover the main problems and theories of criticism The philosophical problems of criticism are difficult enough to require a separate book. See the suggested additional readings for this chapter. And I do not want to bias our discussion about the nature of art by a concern to defend particular theories of criticism. The following discussion is limited to some preliminary clarifications concerning subjectivity and the basis of elementary critical judgments. To begin, we may divide criticism into three components: critics, and that includes all of us some of the time; issue, descriptions of works of art; interpretations of works of art; and evaluations of the quality of works of art. Of these three activities, description is usually conceived to be objective, at least insofar as it is logically distinct from interpretation. Fortunately, sometimes it isn't. These examples show that even description of an artwork can be problematic. Sometimes even to describe the figures in a painting, we must know or guess what the picture is about, what the painter intended to portray. It is not always evident what notes really belong in a piece of music. Sometimes scholars argue that the composer really intended to write down different or additional notes. The recent cleaning of Michelangelo's frescoes on the Sistine Chapel ceiling has caused a storm of controversy over whether frescoes really have bold and bright colors, pinks, greens, oranges, or whether the colors were originally somber, covered by deliberately added haze. But just to say what notes are in a piece of music, or what figures are in a painting, or what colors are in the Sistine Chapel fresco is to engage in mere description. It is to give an account of the elements, forms, properties of a piece, an account that everyone can verify in their experience of the piece. Controversy about criticism really begins with interpretation and evaluation. Most works of art allow multiple interpretations. These interpretations, which say what a work is really about or what it means, go beyond the factual elements of the piece determinable at the level of description. That is, several interpretations are usually compatible with all the facts available from objective descriptions of the work. Those who seek certainty in their beliefs find this situation unacceptable. What makes an interpretation correct or incorrect? We can eliminate some interpretations because they do not fit the objectively determinable features, but of the remaining interpretations, we may not be able to select the best one, or we may select it not because it is objectively the best, but because it appeals to us or illuminates the work in some way. The aspect of criticism most often thought to be completely subjective is evaluation. If I judge a work of art as mediocre and you think it is great, then it pleased you more than it did me. You liked it and I didn't. But as the saying goes, in matters of taste, there is no dispute. People who don't know much about art but know what they like often invoke this egalitarian position. If we seriously accept this position, however, we must face radical relativistic consequences. Everyone's critical or aesthetic judgments, that is, assertions that an artwork is a good or bad one, would be equally valid, because nearly every work of art can evoke the full spectrum of positive and negative responses. For instance, some people prefer supermarket novels and to the novels of Dostoevsky or Muzak to Beethoven. Any estimation about the quality of some artwork as greater and more worthy of study, preservation, and public praise than another artwork would be totally irrational. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, considered the inconsistency of our beliefs about aesthetic evaluation such a paradox that he labeled it antinomy of taste. it is an antinomy because, on the one hand, we are inclined to view critical judgments as subjective, but on the other hand, we aren't at all prepared to accept the consequences of a universal relativism of taste. Every work would be as good as every other work, a drawing by me just as good as one by Leonardo, if I or someone else likes it as much. Alfred Harbidge. Then comes the disgusted comment, a work of art means anything, everything, that is, nothing, and what is the use of discussing it? No use whatever if the object of the discussion is to carry a motion by unanimous vote or to establish a fact as a physicist establishes a formula. Susan Sontag. Interpretation. Is the revenge of the intellect upon the world. To interpret is to impoverish, to deplete the world in order to set up a shadow world of meanings. Quote, meaning. It is certainly true that descriptions and evaluations of art will never approach the precision of the objective measurements of mathematics and science. Still, as Kant pointed out, our passionate disagreements about our interpretations of art shows that we assume our responses and criticisms, though subjective, have a certain objective validity. That is, that our criticisms have a claim to be correct, to be true descriptions of what the work of art is. It is also true that we believe that some people, for example the artists, have much more informed responses than others do. This, too, implies that not all opinions are equally valid. Hume's solution. About 40 years before Kant, famous Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1711-1776, offered one of the most influential solutions to this problem of the standard of taste. See the readings. Hume realized that our thinking about art is influenced by aesthetic skepticism, as I call it. Hume characterized this as a species of philosophy which cuts off all hopes of success in the attempt to find standard of taste, a rule by which the various sentiments of men may be reconciled, at least a decision afforded confirming one sentiment and condemning another. The skeptic's argument is based on what he claims to be the character of judgments of taste which, although they appear to be about the external object, for example, that this drink tastes better than that one, are really mere expressions of subjective preferences. As such, they are neither correct nor incorrect. Hume formulates the skeptic's reasonings. The difference is very wide between judgment and sentiment. All sentiment is right because sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself and is always real, wherever a man is conscious of it. But all determinations of the understandings are not right because they have a reference to something beyond themselves, to wit, real matter of fact, and are not always conformable to that standard. Among 1,000 different opinions which different men may entertain of the same subject, there is one, and but one, that is just and true, and the only difficulty is to fix and ascertain it. On the contrary, 1,000 different sentiments excited by the same object are all right, because no sentiment represents what is really in the object. To the 18th century thinker, the fundamental aesthetic judgment is that something is beautiful. According to Hume, to understand the skeptical position is to realize that it holds that beauty is no quality in things themselves, it exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. To seek the real beauty or real deformity is as fruitless an inquiry as to pretend to ascertain the real sweet or real bitter. It's worth noting that such a position supports the radical relativism considered earlier. Hume finds this consequence absurd. Whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogilvy and Milton, or Bunyan and Addison, would be thought to defend no less an extravagance than if he had maintained a molehill to be as high as Tenerife, or a pond as extensive as the ocean. principle of the natural equality of taste appears a palpable absurdity where objects so disproportioned are compared together. But how are we to account for the fact that some evaluations are much more valid or correct than others unless we treat beauty and other critical characterizations as real properties of the objects we are evaluating? To solve this puzzle along Humean lines, we need to distinguish two different concepts of subjectivity. We distinguish these two claims. Our responses to artworks are not about real objective characteristics of the artwork. We cannot reach a valid agreement about our responses. If we think for a moment about the alleged property of beauty, we can understand the relation of these two claims. It is natural to suppose that beauty cannot be a real property of things because there is such variability and disagreement about what is beautiful. In short, Proposition 2 seems to imply Proposition 1. This is connected to the view that the real characteristics of the world ought to be such that we can define and measure them so as to make a decisive determination of their presence. If we cannot reach any agreement concerning our responses to a particular situation, then our responses are subjective rather than objective. But the important question is whether 1 implies 2. If we are convinced that X is not an objective property of objects, does it follow that we cannot agree on the presence of X? The short answer is no. Since the time of the philosopher John Locke, philosophers have distinguished primary qualities from secondary qualities. Primary qualities are objectively determinable properties, such as the weight or shape of an object. Subjective properties are sensory qualities, such as colors, sounds, tastes, and so forth. Secondary qualities result from the interaction of our senses with physical causes in the external world, such as light and sound waves. The interesting point about secondary qualities is that they appear to be real properties of objects. In spite of what science tells us, we universally treat our world as if it really is full of color, sound, and so forth. Our ability to do this is predicated on the agreement we can achieve about most secondary qualities. For example, we can define the property of being blue as the property something has of causing a normal observer under standard conditions to say it is blue. Hume's solution to the subjectivity of aesthetic or critical evaluations amounts to insisting that our inability to agree about such judgments has been overstated. It is the nature of aesthetic preference to allow for different reactions to items that are similar to each other, but it doesn't follow from this that a broad agreement about items of greatly different aesthetic quality is impossible. Hume suggests that rules of composition and other aesthetic canons are ultimately based on what has been universally found to please in all countries and in all ages, and that our individual abilities to judge what is beautiful are founded upon the common sentiments of human nature. In short, we can consider beauty as analogous to secondary quality whose detection is very delicate and subtle. Hume is not claiming that our judgments of aesthetic qualities are about qualities in the objects. Nonetheless, we may make valid judgments about objects when we claim that an artwork has positive aesthetic features. We are claiming that it has a disposition to please others. Hume explains this agreement about beauty as based on ignorance, prejudice, and so forth. Most people are much more competent to judge everyday secondary qualities than to make the more taxing estimates of artworks. We ignore this fact when we take seriously everyone's opinion, however it was arrived at. Hume draws an analogy with wine tasting. Some people are able to taste minute qualities of various substances in wine, whereas others fail to notice. Whose judgments of wine taste should carry more weight? By analogy, delicacy of imagination, as Hume calls it, is required to judge art. Hume, in fact, gives a number of rules to differentiate critics with proper abilities from those who lack such. The goal is to find those best able to discover what is pleasing to human nature. Hume's account rests upon his belief that, amidst all the variety and caprice of taste, there are certain general principles of approbation or blame, whose influence a careful eye may trace in all operations of the mind. Some particular forms or qualities from the original structure of the internal fabric are calculated to please and others to displease, and if they fail of their effect in any particular instance, it is from some apparent defect or imperfection of the organ. If, in this sound state of the organ, there be an entire or considerable uniformity of sentiment among men, we may thence derive an idea of the perfect beauty. What seems right about Hume's idea is that our critical judgments clearly have reference beyond ourselves to a more general response. We all know that when we praise or condemn an artwork, we are implicitly appealing to the agreements of others. If Hume's theory may strike us as over-optimistic about the existence of a common human nature and about the resulting nearly universal principles of taste, we still can retain the main outlines of his solution. We must be sensitive, knowledgeable, and consistent in our comparisons between artworks of the same kind, and we must apply principles that have generally been found to describe the best, that is, the most pleasing artworks within our culture. Under such conditions, we might not even particularly like something, but realize that it is a good or even great artwork of its kind. To issue an evaluation of an artwork is not, on this account, the same as merely saying, "I like it."